Good morning, everyone. Good evening in Israel, good afternoon in the East Coast, and somewhere in between in South America. Thank you all for joining. We are joined today on the first day of the ceasefire with Iran, even though there is no stop of any fire in Israel, at least from the north part. We are joined today by Eran Etzion, who we hosted on March 3rd, 3 days after the war started. We were both together in DC 6 weeks ago, Iran.
We were in Washington, I
In
believe,
Washington, yeah, we
or
made it
was it New
live from the
York?
hotel
Yeah.
room March 3rd,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
where we were just assuming what's going to happen. I mean, many of the predictions, unfortunately, were true, and we are going to
Mhm.
talk about them. And for those of you who doesn't know me, my name is Ophir Guttelzon. I'm co-founder at UnXeptable. I'm based in Palo Alto. UnXeptable is a grassroots movement started back in 2020 with a mission to save Israeli democracy and doing it together, Israeli expats, Jewish world jury, together with the pro-democracy movement in Israel. Um, and just for the background, Eran Etzion is a diplomat and strategist with over 20 years of experience in senior government position. He is a former deputy of the head of National Security Council and former head of the policy planning division at the Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in 2015, Iran founded the Israeli Center of Strategic Future, an NGO committed to introducing innovative foresight into the Israeli decision-making process and public discourse. So, Iran, thank you so much for joining. Every
That's an
time we
old
start,
CV of Phil.
huh?
An
It's
old CV.
it's a long
I'll,
CV.
s-
Well, I
it's
mean,
an old
like
CV. I'll add a few more words about my recent
you'll
CV.
add
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
introduction as well.
Yeah.
I'm using what I probably had from our based on something changed in the
Yeah.
last 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And we are going to start dive in because every morning we start this morning with one thought that have a topic to talk about, and then we have a surprise. So Iran, I'll give you the next 10 to 15 minutes to both introduce yourself in the right way and to give your brief where we are now, day one to the ceasefire.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Very good to be here. And Ophir, thank you for all the good work. A few words about myself, beyond what Ophir said, which is correct. In the last 10 years, I was part of the pro-democracy movement from its very early stages, and in front of the former Attorney General Mendelblit, trying to push him to actually indict Netanyahu when he was kind of hesitating whether or not to indict. And then throughout the various stages of the pro-democracy movement, the Balfour era, and then the Kaplan era, and all the way to today. And I'm also politically active. I have a public persona. You can follow me on Twitter. And the joke goes, this is a joke that is relatively young, and it wasn't around last time we spoke, I think. The joke is that the three people who are actually benefiting from this war with Iran are Netanyahu, Putin, and myself, because the level of engagement and the numbers of people showing up to my Zooms and to my WhatsApp groups and so on has surged dramatically. And actually, the good news is that Netanyahu is probably no longer a net beneficiary of the war, and we'll talk about that. So I was or wasn't still active in the pro-democracy movement, and I'm also a citizen diplomat, very very active in track two diplomacy in the region, in Europe, and in the States, working with officials and former officials from the Gulf, from Europe, and from the U.S. on galvanizing diplomatic and political solutions to Israel's national security problems and to the regional issues. So that's about me. Now, um, things are happening very quickly. The situation is very fluid. And while I guess, yes, most of what we said last time around turned out to be true, That is not a guarantee that what I'll say today will turn out to be true a month from now, but we'll try. And as far as we can tell at this point, there are a number of things that we can say with at least some certainty. So I'll start with those. We can say with certainty, and I highly advise anybody who hasn't read the New York Times article of, I think, a couple of days ago, which was based on a forthcoming book and was very, very well researched, describing in minute details all the processes that led to the initiation of the war. And the bottom line was very simple. Netanyahu manipulated Trump under false pretense into this war. And while it was pretty clear, at least to me at the very beginning, and I'm sure we spoke about it last time for those of you who heard the last Zoom, now it's abundantly clear to practically anyone. And that is, of course, an extremely, extremely significant fact. Because as you know, the war was not popular in the States from very early on, with good reason, because there was no imminent threat from Iran vis-a-vis the US, and there was no credible reason for the US to launch this war. As you know, Congress was not consulted, other allies were not consulted, and it's not a coincidence. And now we know, it's out there in really excruciating detail, just exactly how Netanyahu used some intelligence material and manipulated it, how the head of Mossad, according to Netanyahu, said that, that toppling the regime is going to be a matter of days and it's going to be easy, and Trump fell for it. And already the blame game has begun in Israel between Netanyahu and the head of Mossad, with the head of Mossad now saying, no, 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 I didn't say it's going to be a few days. I said it's going to be a long process. It could be a year, it could be more. And then there's the question of whether, to what extent Israel was relying, or at least describing a situation where it could rely on Kurdish forces crossing over from Iraq and assisting Iranians to take over the country, which sounds ludicrous to anyone who knows anything about the region, about the Kurds, about Iran. And again, Mossad is saying, no, that's not exactly what we said. Anyway, the blame game is already on, at least in Israel. And as Trump says, we'll see what happens with respect to the blame game within the US, and then the blame game between Trump and Netanyahu, which is going to be interesting to watch. But the overwhelming fact that we now know is that Netanyahu dragged Trump into this war under false pretense, period. And that already has
Was it
extremely,
was
yeah,
it
sorry.
did he try it before with other presidents?
Yes. Netanyahu tried it for 30 to 40 years, depending on when you start counting. Even before he was in government, and certainly immediately when he entered government back in 96. I was in government all in all for over 20 years, and throughout this period, I saw Netanyahu, at least not throughout this period, throughout the period in which I was privy to cabinet meetings and in which he was prime minister, I saw it firsthand. He always had this notion in mind that he will be able to drag the US into war with Iran. And let's emphasize that there were other prime ministers in Israel that firmly rejected this notion. I worked with Arik Sharon, the late Arik Sharon, and with Ehud Olmert, and both of them wouldn't even dream about attempting such a scheme for multiple reasons. But first and foremost, because they realized the amount of damage this would cause to Israel-US relations. We always said, to our American friends, we will never ask you to fight for us. Just give us the tools, and we are the ones that will fend for ourselves. That's that's one of the core pillars of Israel's national security doctrine. But it was always Netanyahu's dream. And unfortunately, for both countries, this lethal combination of Netanyahu and Trump made it happen. And it is already causing enormous damage to the very delicate fabric of Israel-US relations, which was already very badly damaged as a result of everything that transpired after October 7th under the Biden administration, what Israel did in Gaza, Netanyahu's refusal to accept the Biden plan very early on, and so on and so forth. And we now know, and it's really devastating to see, that there is more sympathy towards the Palestinians than towards Israel in the wider American public, and the younger the strata that you poll, the worse the situation becomes. And it cuts across the political aisles. Yes, it's worse amongst Democrats, but it's also very prevailing within Republican ranks. So that's the first fact that we need to understand. The second fact has to do with the gap between the goals of the war, the initial goals of the war, and what was actually achieved. So initially, the goals of the war, as you know, one was the regime change, even though they shied away from stating it, in full. But we know that both Trump and Netanyahu sought regime change. We know that for a fact.
And they said it on the first
Uh,
day.
Not really, they didn't say our goal is regime change. They chose their words, but and we know why.
To set the
Though
environment for a regime change.
exactly create the conditions,
Let's create the
and we know
conditions.
why, because both professional establishments in Israel and in Washington said, this is not doable. We cannot provide, and I'm sure we spoke about it in the last Zoom.
Yeah.
We cannot provide a credible military plan for a regime change in Iran, period. That is what the Mossad said, that is what the CIA said, that is what the IDF said, and that is what the Joint Chief of Staff said in the US. Chief of the Joint Staff, sorry. So we know that regime change was the goal of both Trump and Netanyahu, and we know obviously that it was not achieved. Of course, Trump is saying that it was achieved, because Trump can say anything. But obviously it was not. This is the same regime. Yes, there were some changes, and we can speak about them, but it's certainly not the kind of regime change that was sought by either Netanyahu or by Trump. So that's the first goal. The second was to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat. And I don't want to go into all the details of what this threat really was and to what extent it really existed and so on. If you want, maybe we can
We
go.
can we can elaborate there. Yeah.
Yeah, but we know that the 450 kilos of enriched uranium to 60% is still there. And we know that Iran still retains enrichment capability. And we know that they are entering the negotiations with the same stance that they had before the war, which is we have the right to enrich, and we are not going to agree to the American demand of so-called zero enrichment. So that's the nuclear side. Then there
And
is
taking out the uranium, which is the half ton of uranium, right?
you
They're
mean
not
this
agree. They're not talking about taking it out.
the Iranians right now are not talking about it, but we actually know because of the report by the Omani foreign minister and by the UK national security advisor that were in the negotiations before the war. We know that Iran actually proposed to take this 450 kilos out of Iran. Now, that is not to say that we'll agree to it now, but they did agree to it before the war. So that's the nuclear side. Then there is the missiles issue, in which the stated goal was to severely degrade or to eliminate their entire capability in that area. And we know that it was degraded. There's already a debate to what extent it was actually degraded. At first, at least in Israel, they spoke about 90%. Now they're talking about 50%. And experience teaches us that the Iranians can rebuild that capacity pretty quickly. They get Chinese assistance, they get Russian assistance, and they have their own capabilities. So while yes, it was degraded and arguably even severely degraded, but it's still there. Um, then at some point, about a week ago, the Americans actually repackaged or reframed their war aims. First, it was Secretary Rubio, and then it was Trump himself that conveniently redefined the goals as follows. They said, these are the goals of the operation. Of course, they're not calling it a war for legal reasons. Otherwise, they have to seek congressional approval and all that. One, eliminating the Iranian Air Force. Okay, when Rubio said it a week ago, there was no longer an Iranian Air Force, and actually, even to begin with, there wasn't really an Iranian Air Force. They hardly had any, and whatever they did have was bombed in the very first days of the war, so that's already an achieved goal. The second was to eliminate the Iranian Navy. And again, they didn't really have a navy. They had some 24 ships of various sizes, and they were all eliminated, again, in the first days of the war. So this has already been achieved when it was stated as a war. The third goal was to severely degrade their missiles capability for launch and for production. And again, when Rubio spoke about it, it was already achieved. And the last one was to harm their production, their industrial base, their factories, their industrial base, which again was achieved already when Rubio uttered it. And all of those four goals are in order for Iran to never have a nuclear weapon, which, as you know, is the stated goal of virtually any American president in the last, I don't know, 30 years or so. So they reframed the goals in a way that guaranteed that they would be achieved. And as far as Israel is concerned, there is more ambiguity in terms of the actual goals of the war. Israel is less clear about what it actually sought to achieve, and more careful about saying that those aims were actually achieved. Netanyahu is very skilled at this game, and he's very careful to say two things that might sound contradictory, but they're actually not. One is that, under his leadership, Israel achieved the most glorious possible military achievements. And we have eliminated this and eliminated that and blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, he says the job is not done. And we will keep our watch and keep fighting. And this is not over. And this is just another set in a long play. So that's the second point about the war aims. Now let's say a word about the negotiations and about Lebanon, and with this we can conclude the opening statement. Yeah. The Iranians obviously feel that they are, maybe not obviously, but feel that they are victorious. Their definition of victory is, we haven't lost, the regime is still standing. Yes, we lost significant assets, but we were able to withstand the 40 days of attack by the mightiest military force on earth, plus the strongest military in the Middle East combined, and we're still standing. And we're able to inflict harm, and we were able to block the Hormuz Straits, and we were able to hurt significantly some of the Gulf countries, and so on. So they're entering these negotiations with the feeling that they have persevered and they are in a position of strength. And therefore, they have those 10 demands, which you probably saw. There are various versions of it, but they were published, most of which are not acceptable, obviously, to the Americans. Some of them are really, completely outrageous, at least in some of the versions. For example, a total evacuation of all US forces from all bases in the Gulf. That's not going to happen. Um, but some of them are, from an American perspective, negotiable. And the Americans, on their part, presented a 15-point document, which again was not officially published. And some of it was kind of leaked to the press, but it's still not entirely clear what those 15 points are. I will tell you what I can surmise from all of this, and this is speculative, okay? This is not based on any kind of concrete information. If there is a deal to be had, it will be based on legitimizing the regime, and not only by the Americans, but by all other actors, including the Chinese, the Russians, and the Gulfies. They will have to somehow reassure the Iranians that they are a legitimate regime and that they will not be attacked by any party, including Israel. This will be a very strict demand that the Iranians will, I think, stick to for obvious reasons. So that's a core demand, which I suspect, again, if there is an agreement, this demand will be met. Not exactly sure in which way, shape, or form, but we're talking kind of high level. The second Iranian demand is going to be the lifting of all sanctions. And here too, I believe that if there will be an agreement, most, if not all, of this demand will have to be met. Now, what will the Iranians give in return? They will open the Hormuz Straits, and I think they will try to bargain for some sort of a regime under their control. It could be joint control. As you heard, Trump is already fantasizing about maybe joint control by the Iranians and the Americans. Why not? You know.
I don't know if you saw
So
it, Iran, but it was just announced that stop. It was just announced that the money that will be collected from the Hormuz fees will be running on the Tor network, which is owned by Witkoff and Trump's sons.
okay, there you have it. Very nice. Yeah, ingenious. How come they didn't think about it before? Um, so, and that's just one example. There are other already ideas floating about, U.S. energy companies entering the Iranian market, and all sorts of other lucrative collaborations between American entities and Iranian entities. And that's very Trumpish. So this is one thing, if you want, that the Iranians will give in return. Then there is the issue of the nuclear project. And here, again, I believe that the Iranians will be willing, I suspect the Iranians will be willing to reinstate some sort of a monitoring and verification regime, like the JCPOA. They will be willing to extract the 450 kilos and maybe dilute them, maybe export them, whatever, but they will not give up their right to enrich. So perhaps there will be kind of common ground whereby Trump will be able to say, I have achieved zero enrichment, but the Iranians will be able to say, we have not forfeited our right, and we have maintained some residual capability. Um, and about the missiles, I suspect the most that might be achieved is some minor limitations on some of the longer range missiles, so that Trump will be able to say there will not be any Iranian threat on US soil, and maybe also not on European soil. But there will be still a threat on Israeli soil, obviously on Gulf soil, and on the entire Middle East soil.
And what about the proxies? I mean, Hezbollah is still there, or we can talk about it when we talk about Lebanon.
We can talk about when we talk about Lebanon. I think this is something that the Iranians might be willing to trade. If they get everything I already mentioned, I think this is something that they might be willing to trade.
Okay,
I'll stop
so
here. Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper to there is basically a couple of points I want to look at, and the latest news is one that the ceasefire is still holding except Lebanon until yesterday. I mean, yesterday there was a huge. I mean, I wasn't even able to follow that. I mean, you can tell more about what Israel did in Lebanon. And then the news from tonight is that suddenly we have negotiations for peace agreement that you were advocating for the last 2 or 3 weeks,
Yes.
and created some petition for that. So talk more about that because that seems to be like the one interesting positive outcome of this whole war.
Yes, it is very interesting. Um, let's start with that in terms of laying out the facts. The first fact that one needs to understand, if you don't know it already, is that the Lebanese government officially submitted a proposal, a historic, unprecedented proposal to the Israeli government several weeks ago to launch negotiations immediately on all issues standing between the two countries, including, of course, the issue of Hezbollah and its armament, and with a goal of full normalization and even peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon, whereby Lebanon will recognize the state of Israel. All of this is obviously unprecedented. We're not talking about this miserable episode of 1982 with Bashir Gemayel, those of you who remember it, which was an Israeli collaborator, a Christian Lebanese Israeli collaborator that was prime minister for 15 seconds and then was assassinated. Or, let's disregard that. This is a first ever official proposal by a legitimate Lebanese government from a country that always said they will be the last to sign a peace agreement with Israel. Now they're saying we're willing to be the first. Of course, they're not the first historically, but the first, since Jordan, okay? Which is really amazing. And any kind of legitimate, pragmatic, um, any Israeli government that had the national interest in mind would jump on this proposal. But of course, given the gap between the national interest and Netanyahu's personal and political interest, Netanyahu chose not to respond to it. He didn't want to pay the price of refusing it. He obviously didn't want to accept it, so he just ignored it. Until virtually a few hours ago, he ignored it. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second is that when the announcement on the overall ceasefire went out, which was what, 24 hours ago, something like that, by the Pakistani Prime Minister, and you need to know, if you don't know it already, that Pakistan is the front, but China is the one that really, pulled all the levers on Iran and on other actors in the region in order to push for this ceasefire, which was very interesting and will have consequences. When this announcement went out, it specifically said that it includes Lebanon. And this was obviously agreed upon between the Pakistanis, the Iranians, and the Americans. And then Netanyahu rejected it, and Trump, unfortunately, went with Netanyahu again and said, yes, Lebanon is not included. And then Iran threatened to break the entire deal and retaliate. As Ophir mentioned, Netanyahu sent the IDF with the most massive bombardment of various parts of Lebanon, including Beirut, including civilian targets. Some 300 Lebanese were killed, most of which probably were civilians, unfortunately, and hundreds more were wounded. It was a devastating blow for the legitimacy of the Lebanese government. It enraged the Lebanese at large, against Israel, of course. And it created really a situation where the ceasefire was on the brink of collapse. And, it still might collapse. But evidently, since then, Trump put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. And Netanyahu succumbed and said, okay, I will launch negotiations, or I will agree to launch negotiations based on the Lebanese proposal, but I retain the right to exercise continuous military attacks while we negotiate. The slogan is, we negotiate only under fire. So we'll see what happens with that
Well,
and
definitely
how
the
long.
fire is keep going, keep coming to Israel.
Yes, that's true. Hezbollah keeps shooting. That's true. So that's where we stand with Lebanon, and it's true, as Ophir said, I was campaigning for not directly vis-a-vis Netanyahu because I have zero trust in the guy, and I don't want to be in a position where anybody from the opposition asks Netanyahu to do anything. Forget about that. But we did issue a petition and thousands of people signed that urged all actors to intervene in order to launch negotiations between Israel and Lebanon now. Um, and I can tell you from some initial polling that there is an Israeli majority, even though unfortunately it's not huge, some 60% or so, that support these negotiations. And there is a parallel majority in Lebanon that supports these negotiations. So, on the positive side, negotiations are beginning. They hold a lot of promise. It is very clear that in the long run, Hezbollah must be disarmed. It is also clear that this is not a mission that the IDF can execute, and the only army that can actually execute it is the Lebanese army. But in order for them to be able to do it, first of all, they need legitimacy and they need the right political framework. And then they need arms, they need additional manpower, and they need regional and international support, probably by way of a robust peace enforcing mission. I would say comprised of Arab armies, European armies, and maybe also some American contingency. And that will be negotiated. But my suspicion is that Netanyahu is not going to negotiate in good faith. He will try to scuttle the negotiations. I'm reminded of the Madrid conference back in 91, those of you who remember it. Netanyahu sent a head of delegation whose
Shamir,
mandate, sorry?
Shamir, not?
Sorry, Shamir. Sorry, thank you. Shamir, who's Netanyahu's role model and was prime minister at the time, sent a head of delegation. I forget his name, maybe if you remember. And his mandate was not to negotiate, but to filibuster the negotiation. So he gave those endless speeches. He really aggravated his counterparts, but that was his mandate to play for time, to filibuster, and not to move an inch. And Netanyahu, I suspect, is going to do something similar now.
You're talking about Eliakim
So,
Rubinstein?
no, it was somebody else.
Okay.
I will get the name.
Okay.
Um, and what I believe people like us should do under these circumstances is to raise our voices and demand, again, not from Netanyahu, but from anybody and everybody else, first and foremost, Trump, to make sure that these negotiations proceed, to make sure that the ceasefire in Lebanon is announced and enforced as soon as possible, and that Netanyahu is not allowed to use the negotiations in order to scuttle this track or the overall regional ceasefire, which again he will try to do for sure. Um, that's it on Lebanon.
I want to ask you about Lebanon. I mean, like one of the things that is obviously a good question about the people who would say, like, well, we had 15 months, right? About since the last ceasefire with Hezbollah, the Lebanese was
Yes.
there, the Lebanese government was there. They could have taken out Hezbollah. What has changed? Why now is different effort?
Okay. Good question. Here is the answer. First of all, the government that signed the original ceasefire in November 24 was not this government. It was a different government in which Hezbollah had a veto power. A few months after, this government came into being, democratically elected, in which Hezbollah does not have a veto power. And this government took upon itself to seriously implement the ceasefire. And the ceasefire calls for the disarming of Hezbollah in the first phase south of the Litani. So they made real serious efforts and were able to disarm approximately 80% of Hezbollah's capabilities south of the Litani, which is a lot in a relatively short period of time. Yes, it's not enough. Yes, we would have liked them to do more, but they made an effort. It was a serious effort, and the results were more than okay. And that's according to a UN report and to American reports as well. Then, because they obviously became under a lot of pressure from Hezbollah and Hezbollah's supporters in Lebanon, they went through the Americans to Netanyahu and asked, even begged Netanyahu to give them some slack in order for them to build their legitimacy. And they specifically asked for 1 month of cessation of Israeli targeted killings and attacks against Hezbollah targets, and the evacuation of at least one of the outposts out of 5 outposts that Israel left on Lebanese territory after November. Perfectly reasonable demands, if you ask me. And again, any pragmatic government, noble government, peace-seeking government would have probably obliged, but Netanyahu said no, and this took away from the legitimacy of the Lebanese government. Nevertheless, and by the way, today, just today, there were some reports in the Israeli press about some of the inner discussions within the Israeli military and within the Israeli national security establishment that preceded the war, and when they deliberated whether or not it is worthwhile for Israel to launch war against Hezbollah, given the fact that this ceasefire situation is actually pretty good. And some serious people were saying, what probably I would have said if I was still in office, don't touch this. We're not gonna, this is almost the best of all worlds. We have a ceasefire agreement. We have a legitimate Lebanese government. We have an ongoing process of disarming of Hezbollah. We, as Israel, are able to shoot out whichever threat we identify. What more can you look for? But of course, for Netanyahu, it's all about perpetuating war, opening more fronts, not allowing any negotiations or any stability. That's the strategy. So
So
that's it.
that's the explanation of why now it might be different. And again, I mean, the change is, again, we are still with the same government, and that's actually bring us to the next part is, I mean, I just looked at the polls from tonight in Israel,
Mhm.
and it seems like the whole situation is still status quo. It's like there is still like about 70 seats to the opposition parties to Netanyahu and about 50 seats for Netanyahu, plus minus. Ben Gvir is getting a little bit more seats. The Democrats getting a little bit, but overall the two blocks are about the same. So is that something that the Lebanese agreement is the next move of Netanyahu to try and build his reputation, do you think?
No, I don't
Okay.
think so. Probably Netanyahu's next move is to try and completely unravel the situation in Gaza and relaunch war in Gaza.
Is
He's
there any
already,
deadline that is coming up?
no,
There was something
not that I
about
remember.
eliminating the Hamas weapon until.
Yeah, actually you're right. They did give some like 1 week or so, but yes, and Netanyahu might want to use it. Yes, you're right. Um, so that's one thing. The other, of course, is the West Bank. It just came out today that Netanyahu approved some 63 new outposts in the West Bank, the largest ever batch of such outposts probably in history to be approved at once. That was kept secret, so as the Americans will not express any protest. And now it's out. And we know that settler violence and terrorism is raging. And it breaks records every day now with really horrible terror acts, torturing of innocent civilians, killing, wounding, taking over land, driving out whole communities, really horrible, horrible crimes. And of course, the government is behind them, and government is pushing them. It's
So,
like a
so you're
political
saying he will
game.
try to keep the flames in such a level up to the election.
Yes.
So it's not
And
it's
he
not
will
the peace
try.
process that is going to take him to the next level.
No. But relative to what you said about the Poles, he launched this entire scheme of the Iran war and pulling Trump in and all of that under the overall strategy of achieving a quick win in Iran and then being able to leverage it politically, including via this Trump visit that, by the way, might still happen on Independence Day, and with Trump intervening on Netanyahu's behalf in the context of the elections and also in trying to annul his trial and all of that. It's going to be very interesting to see uh, whether or not Trump's approach will now change towards Netanyahu.
Well, he's getting
Uh,
the Israel prize in 2 weeks in Israel, no? He's coming to
Again,
Israel
up
to
until
receive
now,
the highest
up
prize that was
yes,
never gave to anyone before.
as long as the war was on, all planning went on as if Trump is not coming. Okay, now that we have the peace, this ceasefire for 2 weeks, I don't know if Trump will take the chance of traveling to Israel because, of course, it can unravel very quickly, and he doesn't want to be here when missiles are flying. So we'll see. We'll see what happens, as he says. But more importantly, given everything that transpired, given the New York Times investigative reporting, given the fact that now everybody in the States, not only on the Democratic side, but practically everywhere, is convinced that Trump was fooled by Netanyahu. I'm sure Trump, doesn't like this. And I would not be surprised if it will have an effect on his attitude towards Netanyahu. But we'll see.
We'll see. I mean, like in our last conversation with Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, I mean, like we discussed that, and that was kind of like the example of like, I mean, that President Trump is in his authoritarian process, right? Needs to
Hmm.
keep him around him mostly people who are criminals, right? So
Hmm.
that might be still the only person in Israel right now, which is Netanyahu. So we don't know that.
Yeah, maybe.
I want I want us to. It also came through a couple of questions that to just get out from this Iran-Israel conflict and go upper in the level to China, Russia, and the
Hmm.
rest of the reason. Which again, I mean, like some people will say, like, well, while we think that Netanyahu was fooling Trump, Trump has other agenda, right? For America to become greater, to dismantle China, and so on and so on. But who are I mean, like on the I mean, right now people like Pakistan are now negotiators, and Russia and China might. Someone wrote me that it might be the next after the Suez element, the pound lost its value comparing to
Yes,
others. So maybe you can talk more about that.
yes. Um, there's a lot of speculation that Trump had a real strategic plan in all of this, as you alluded, and that this is actually about China and weakening China and taking over Iranian oil to take it away from China and so on and so forth. I don't buy this for a second. I'm sorry. I don't give Trump this kind of credit. I believe what was written in the New York Times about the lead out to this war. It had nothing to do with China. However, of course, once it happened, it does have consequences, and it did elicit certain reactions from China. So here is what I think you need to understand. First of all, as you know, the entire Persian Gulf on the Arab side of it was under a US security umbrella for decades. Some of it was formal defense agreements between the US and the Saudis, the US and the Emiratis and others. Part of it was the basing, those US bases scattered around essentially almost every GCC country, and first also in Saudi, and after 9/11 taken out of Saudi, but in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain, and so on. And the assumption was that the presence of these American forces gives those GCC countries a shield against Iran, and that Iran will not dare attack those bases or the countries in which those bases are located. And of course, as we all understand, this assumption crumbled, and the Iranians did not hesitate and viciously attacked the bases and the countries. And according to some reports, those attacks were actually very effective, and all of those bases were very quickly evacuated, and then those soldiers were moved to hotels, and then in turn those hotels were bombarded by the Iranians. So from the perspective of the Gulfies, the entire security doctrine, US based or based on the US, crumbled. And they're panicking, and they're actively searching for alternatives. In a different world, the natural alternative would have been China. A country like Saudi can go to China and tell them either as an alternative to the US or as an addition to the US, give us, some sort of a defense umbrella. But the Chinese don't operate this way, or at least they have not operated this way up until now. They prefer economic leverages, they prefer different instruments of power, and they don't offer this kind of umbrella. The Russians potentially could offer something, but they're not very credible partners in the eyes of the Gulfies, and also they're very much preoccupied in the Ukraine and so on, so it's not really an alternative. What they are left with are new and innovative approaches that are based on regional coalitions. And this is actually where Pakistan comes in. Because after the 12-day war, what the Saudis did, they very quickly went to Pakistan. They have historical relations. There are strong rumors running around for decades that there are secret agreements between the Saudis and the Pakistanis on the nuclear issue, and all sorts of interesting rumors. But after the 12-day war, the Saudis, out in the open, went to the Pakistanis and signed a formal defense pact, including the nuclear dimension. But unfortunately for them, once this war fell on them and the Iranians attacked them and all of that, they approached the Pakistanis and asked them for defense based on the agreement. And the Pakistanis, to put it diplomatically, were not actually very forthcoming. The Saudis are still interested in this some sort of a regional security architecture with the Pakistanis, with the Turks, with the Egyptians, and maybe others. And this quartet of Saudi, Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt was very active in reaching this ceasefire. So they are now kind of this new and upcoming coalition, regional coalition, which will probably try to formalize, which will probably try to establish itself as kind of the new kings, regional kings. If not instead of America, then at least in addition to America. And from the Chinese perspective, they have, on the one hand, they have an opportunity here to replace the Americans or to heighten their involvement in the region in various respects, including the military side, but also economically and otherwise. And I think they're thinking about it. And the fact that they were so active in pushing this ceasefire is an early indication of that. And as you know, Trump was supposed to travel to Beijing for a very important summit with Xi Jinping. It was supposed to happen, I think, 2 weeks ago or something like that. It was postponed to May 15. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch what exactly will be discussed under the title of Middle East and Iran and Persian Gulf and all of that between those two leaders.
What about the Ukraine-Russia war? One of the things it struck me last time on our conversation. You said like that you quoted someone that says like that every missile that was used on this war has not
Hmm.
been used to save Ukraine. And obviously, there is the NATO agreement that now is being uh,
Yes.
discussed. So maybe we can cover that.
Yes. When I say Putin is the big winner of this war, and I said it in last Zoom, and I say it here now, and even more with more confidence, and it's very clear. Um, One issue absolutely is the devastation of NATO. It was already in a very bad situation before this war transpired, and it became much worse. The rupture between Trump and the Europeans has widened, and the Europeans are actively building a new version of NATO without the US. Just today, it was announced by Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, that NATO will be willing to assist in the opening of Hormuz or something like that. I don't give it a lot of credibility. I think there is zero trust now between the Europeans and Trump. And unfortunately, it is quite probable that NATO might even formally cease to exist as we know it. Um, but informally, effectively, it is already breaking. And as you know, this was Putin's life mission. From his perspective, there is no bigger strategic triumph than being able to break NATO. So that's number one. Number two, as you mentioned, all the munitions that might have assisted Ukraine, including Patriot missiles and all kinds of munitions, were actually spent in the Gulf at the expense of Ukraine and therefore for the benefit of Putin. Then there is the issue of oil sanctions that were lifted partially on Russia in order to try and quell some of the surges in the oil prices, which was an enormous gain for Putin. And more generally, now that the Gulf flow of energy is either totally blocked or will be more restricted and less certain, and insurance rates are going to be much higher, and there's a whole new element of a question mark, if you want, or uncertainty regarding the provision of oil from the Gulf. This is also very good for Putin, who can be an alternative supplier, certainly to China and maybe to other countries as well. And the overall rise in oil prices obviously also plays into Putin's hands. So he's the big winner, yes.
He's a big
But it's,
winner.
in, it's interesting to note that Ukraine is also winning slightly. You saw that Zelensky visited the Gulf, signed all sorts of cooperation agreements. Everybody is now panicking with regard to the drone issue. And Ukraine is the number one country in the world, probably alongside Israel. I think in some respects they're better than us in the usage of drones, both on defending against drones and also attacking with drones. So every country is now seeking to sign contracts with them for cooperation, for arms sales, for development, and so on. So that is, shall we say, a small win for the Ukraine as well.
Eran, we're almost on time. I just want to know if you want to stay another 10 minutes to answer some more questions that we have. So it's up to
Yeah, it's
you.
fine. Yeah.
There is a question. We talked about the relation. We keep saying that there will be elections in Israel. Again, officially it's October 27. We need 3 months ahead of time. One of the 3 months announcement ahead of the date. So again, there is a lot of speculation, maybe in September, maybe in October. My assumption is that Netanyahu will want to stay in power as much as possible, including Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but that's just an assumption. um, there is there is this thing that you are keep saying that the next government, whoever it will be, right, will need to be very, very different in their state of mind to try and overcome the sabotage of the impression that everyone has about Israel in the world. I mean, what do
Mhm.
you think will be step number one in that sense, following the election? And the second question is like, is Abraham Accord is still the platform that we can rebuild relationship with other organizations, or do we need other countries, sorry, or we need a new platform for that?
Let me say what I think the next government must do on those issues, and then I will give an assessment of, who's who in the book, and what may or may not happen. So in terms of what the next government should do, to me, it's very clear. They need to act decisively, quickly, drastically, in the opposite direction of Netanyahu on everything regional. What does it mean? It means that they should initiate what I call the Riyadh summit, which is modeled upon the Madrid conference. And the idea is to kind of package together all the issues that need to be negotiated either regionally, multilaterally, or bilaterally. Israel and the Palestinians, track one. Israel and Lebanon, track two. Israel and Syria, track three, bilateral. And then a regional security architecture group in which all regional actors will participate, including Israel. And this, from an Israeli perspective, is a way to make sure that Israel is included in the future regional security architecture, because otherwise we will be left out. Then regional economic cooperation. And we can have many other groups. We can have a water group. We can have, a science group. We can have an AI group. There's many, many issues who are of common interest to most, if not all, of the countries in the region. And the outcome of such a conference can be a series of agreements, bilateral and multilateral. And this is not, it sounds like maybe a pipe dream, but it's not. It already happened in 1991 in the shape of the Madrid conference, which was not a huge success because of Yitzhak Shamir, who was the prime minister at the time and tried to scuttle it. But if there is an Israeli government that plays along, it has an enormous potential. And also, last time around, it didn't just collapse. It actually created the Oslo process and all the other positive processes that took place at the time, during the mid-90s, that I was part of, and probably many of you remember. So that should be step one. Convene the Riyadh conference. And I know from my conversations with the Saudis, Emiratis, and others that they will be happy to do it, assuming they have a genuine Israeli partner who is willing to commit to a policy of conflict resolution. Conflict resolution rather than conflict management. Conflict resolution with the Palestinians, conflict resolution with the Arabs. Once and for all, to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflict. And yes, they are tied together. And to your question, no, the Abraham Accords are not the right framework, because the entire idea of the Abraham Accords is to circumvent the Palestinian issue. And that's not going to work from the perspective of the Saudis and from the perspective of all other actors, and also from the perspective of Israel. So
And
that's
and the
in a
next and the
nutshell.
next potential and the next potential prime ministers from the opposition understand that, you think, in Israel?
Okay, so that's in a nutshell what I propose the next government, in broad brush, what I propose the next government should do on these issues. We need to say a word about Iran before I move on to answer your question. And of course, it's complicated, and it will depend on the outcome of the negotiations and everything that will transpire between now and the elections. But again, broadly speaking, I can see two potential scenarios. In a more positive scenario, we have an Iran that is already within the confines of an agreement with the Americans. And as I said before, it will be also guaranteed by the Chinese, Russians, and so on. And it will create inevitably, it will create a certain agreed upon security and diplomatic environment in the Gulf, at least. And it will and should, I would argue, involve Israel. And I would like us in that scenario to enter into a non-belligerency agreement with the Iranians. I wouldn't want to do it via the Americans or via the Chinese or whatnot. I would like to enter into a bilateral agreement with the Iranians for mutual non-belligerency, which also answers the proxy issues, because of course Israel will demand non-belligerency means both direct and indirect. So no more Iranian assistance to Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah and so on. That's the more kind of the better scenario. The worst scenario is where we have a belligerent Iranian regime that whichever way, shape, or form is not confined by an agreement and is actively hostile, not only to Israel, but also to the Gulf countries. And in that situation, we need to work with the Gulfies and with the Americans and maybe with others to build a new security architecture which is directed against Iran. And right now, the Gulfies will not go along with it because they're in a bind. We don't have time to elaborate. But right now, I suspect they will not go along with it. But if, 6 months from now, we're in a situation where the diplomacy with Iran did not work, I think they will be open to it. Now, thinking about potential compositions of the next Israeli government and prime ministership and so on. Very quickly, Naftali Bennett is a reincarnation of Netanyahu. His actual positions, his ideology, there's zero difference between him and Netanyahu on policy issues. He's not as corrupt, but his policies are identical to Netanyahu's. So he is not going to be interested in conflict resolution. And the only possibility for him to actually be part of something along the lines that I described is via coercion. American coercion, international coercion, regional coercion, and so on. Will such coercion take place? I believe the short answer is yes.
If
Because
I may add on that, just Eran, I mean, it's obviously
yeah.
depends also on the composition of this coalition, right? How how
Yes, I'm
how
speaking
how
about,
much of this
you're right.
coalition will be
Yes, you're right. I'm speaking about the coalition um, which is devoid of parties from the current coalition. Without the Likud, without the Haredim, without the Kahana mutations and all of that. A coalition of the willing in the good sense. A coalition of Democrats, right, center, and left. And you're right, it's not the only possibility. It's very possible that Bennett will align himself with Netanyahu after the elections.
Mhm.
But if Bennett is prime minister and the coalition is that kind of coalition, then everything I said is relevant. Actually, it's also relevant if it is a Bennett-led coalition with the Likud and others. Because, the situation, the overall geopolitical environment will be the same. And coercion will take place also. But it will be harder because of the nature of that coalition. So if that is the case for Bennett. Eisenkot is different, but not too different. He's not a rightist ideologue, but he's also not, how shall I put it? He's not somebody that would seriously push for conflict resolution. Certainly not with the Palestinians. He doesn't have shall we say, he doesn't have the relevant experience. He doesn't have that kind of worldview. He's simply not there. He's much more of a status quo player than a change agent. But he's a reasonable person. Hopefully, he will be attentive to international actors, Americans and others. And again, if his coalition is the kind of coalition we spoke about earlier, of essentially current opposition with at least one Arab party, something like that, then I think it could be some of the things I described can actually materialize.
So, Iran, I want to finalize bring this call to a close. And one of the questions that I keep getting is, what do you think Israeli expats and Jewish Americans and Jewish worldwide could do directly with Israeli candidates or the grassroots organizations or others to make sure that, again, what's happening in Israel, we know it's influencing us here, right? Then what do you think we should do here in order to bring to a new coalition, a new future, and to your point of view from your experience in the past that you were an Israeli consul, right, here in the Bay Area in the
Yeah,
past,
San Francisco, yes.
San Francisco,
Um, San Francisco and the
and the
Pacific Northwest.
northwest of
Pacific
yeah,
Northwest,
Pacific
yeah,
Northwest, yes.
from Alaska to mid California, more or less. Fresno, I think, was our southernmost point. Um, so, um, First of all, let me do some shameless self-promotion. Those of you who are interested in assisting my projects, including the Lebanon project and some other um, changing reality via statesmanship, which is my slogan. If you're interested in that, you can join my WhatsApp groups. You can be in touch with me, and I'll be very happy if you do that. Secondly, in terms of parties in Israel, I urge you to support the Democratic Party in Israel, which is the one most aligned with everything I said, and is the combination, as you know, of labor and Meretz, and is really the only center-left party in Israel, which is credible, which is upcoming under the leadership, the brave leadership of Yair Golan, and I urge you to support that party. And as the stronger they will be, the better chances we have of actual conflict resolution strategies and all the things that we discussed, the positive things we discussed, potentially materializing. Then on the pro-democracy movement, we're still on the elections. Of course, those of you who are eligible to vote in Israel, please do so. Board a plane, make sure that you're there, even if it costs a little, and there are some organizations supporting that, so please do that. Those of you who are able to contribute to political candidates, obviously do that. Um, um, in terms of other activities outside of actual partisan or political activity, per se, there's a host of pro-democracy organizations that are still very active. Obviously, Ophir's organization is one of them, but there are others as well. And anything you can do to contribute to those activities, obviously, will be a blessing. There's so much work that needs to be done.
And I
We hardly spoke about the attack that Netanyahu is mounting on our democracy, which is entering its very critical stages. He's pushing on under the guise of the war and trying to complete the total overtaking of the Israeli state, Israeli institutions, and Israeli soul, and converting it from a liberal democracy to an autocracy.
We had a Zoom in the beginning of the week with Gabi Lasky and Natsar Augusti and
Okay,
uh,
so you know,
I'm
yeah,
blinking out.
yes,
And Oded Feller. And I would just add on what you said about the grassroots. I mean, like, so again, we are unacceptable. We're basically trying to make accessible to anyone that doesn't have the rights to vote in Israel, the ability to support anything around voter turnout, voter intimidation, and safeguarding the election. So we'll send more information about that soon. But if you know anyone that can help us with that, locally to great salons and others, then you can reach out to me and we'll continue to do that. With that, Eran, I want to thank you again for jumping on that call. I want to thank Adva and Regina and Janet for helping me organizing it, and to Romy from your team. and Sivan, and everyone is working really, really hard to make sure we are safeguarding Israel, saving democracy, and bringing it to a different level of appreciation in the world that we don't have right now in Israel. So thank you
Thank
all,
you all very much, and thank you,
and we will
Ophir.
send summary and recording on the YouTube.
Great.
It Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.